Hello, everyone. I'm Lori with Behavior Education at Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary. Welcome to Royals at the Ranch for Thursday, August 11th, 2022. This is part 2 in our Gradual Desensitization series. And in part 1, we went over presence and proximity. In part 2, we're going to go over touch and a little tiny bit of handling. There is going to be a part 3 where we talk about a lot of handling. I'm going to start by reviewing the introduction from last week's video very quickly. For those of you who haven't seen it, I recommend that you go watch it. And if you haven't watched part 1 of this Gradual Desensitization series, which was on presence and proximity, you need to go watch that first. And then you need to watch the Royals at the Ranch episode from last week. And then you're ready to watch this one. Gradual desensitization is gradually exposing the snake to something that is scary or distressing for it at a level below the threshold at which it is exhibiting signs of fear, anxiety, and distress. And when it starts to approach that threshold, you want to back off or remove the scary thing. And the snake has to always be able to get away from the aversive stimulus anytime it chooses. And then over time, you're gradually working up to a point where that scary thing is less scary and less distressing for the snake. That fear and stress threshold is higher and higher until the snake is no longer bothered by whatever it was that was scaring them. And many times, remember, that is us. In part 1, I detailed how to use approach and retreat to gradually desensitize snakes to your presence and proximity. So to move on to part 2, your snake has to be comfortable and remaining visible when you're in the room. And they have to be staying out and doing their normal activities in a comfortable and relaxed manner when you are close to their enclosure and you're moving around and doing things right outside their habitat, even with their door open. If you think you're ready for you and your snake to move on to the next step, just check yourself. You need to be honest with yourself about where you're at with your snake in this approach and retreat process, and they need to be truly comfortable and relaxed with you nearby, with you in the room, coming at least to the door and maybe even partially out of their enclosure before you can introduce considerate touch and handling. So if you can say that your snake is in this blue circle, all of the green arrows then are pointing to it's okay to introduce considerate touch and handling, which is where we're going to start in this video. Before we start, just like with the desensitization to your presence of proximity, we're going to use approach and retreat to introduce touch and introduce some minimal handling. You'll see that occurring in some of the video examples here, but just remember that at any time, if your snake is displaying body language and behavior that indicates fear, anxiety, or distress, includes avoidance and retreat and freezing, any kind of threat displays, then you need to stop and retreat and back off, and don't approach again until your snake is comfortable and relaxed. This is the first option for introducing touch for the very first time with your snake. Let the snake come to you. When the snake is in proximity to you, give them an opportunity to approach you and investigate you first. Now, I realize that can be scary if you're not sure what your snake's going to do. Usually, they're approaching you and they're tongue flicking, and that's because they are investigating you. They're getting your scent. They're smelling you. They're trying to figure out what you are. If you're uncomfortable doing that and the snake is near the upper part of your body, your face, your neck, your hands, your arms, this picture demonstrates how you can do that by just placing your feet near your snake and letting them approach your shoes, letting them climb on your legs. It's a little bit less scary for us the first time we're letting a snake approach us to do it this way than with our hands and arms, but you can certainly use your hand. So you're going to allow the snake to touch you first, and you're going to repeat this during several sessions until the snake no longer behaves in a manner that says they think you're new, you're a novel object, or that you're a stimulus they're not familiar with. When you are basically something that's familiar to them now and they're not really reacting to you, then you can move on to the next steps. Here's a video example of what I mean by you can use your hand to let them approach you, and usually you want to do that maybe when they're first coming out of an exercise space, when they're already out crawling, when they're coming out of their enclosure, and you're just going to have to trust that they aren't going to bite you. If they're fearful, they're going to retract, they're going to back off, and you just allow them to do that. You are doing absolutely nothing but placing your hand near them or in their path and allowing them to do whatever it is that they're comfortable doing, whether that is avoid your hand, retreat from your hand, smell your hand, tongue flick at your hand, or climb onto your hand. That's what you're going to let them do, and you're going to take no other action other than just offering your hand. Again, if you're not comfortable with that, try offering your feet instead, or a different part of your body that you're more comfortable having in close proximity to the snake the first time you're allowing them to investigate you. This is another video example of allowing the snake to touch you first. I opened the enclosure door and I did nothing else but put my hand up next to the enclosure. I didn't even put it in the enclosure or on the enclosure threshold. I put it just below the enclosure threshold. So this snake literally was free to remain in the enclosure, come out of the enclosure and go left or right and avoid my hand completely. He is free to start investigating my hand and decide that he doesn't like that and retreat. That's exactly what he's doing here. Now, I don't know subjectively in his mind if he was thinking, oh, I don't like her, or if he just wanted to make sure that I was going to allow him to get away. But I'm literally doing nothing. My hand is just there as a ledge or a branch for him to climb out onto if he chooses. And this is a great way to get the snake used to your smell and what your body and your clothing feels like, and also start helping them learn that you're not something that's scary, that you're not going to invade their space, that you're a safe place for them to be if they choose to interact with you and engage with you. You're not going to hurt them. You're going to be strong and steady, a strong, steady tree branch for them to climb onto, or a ledge for them to rest on. And that's exactly what this snake is learning here. Allowing the snake to touch you first might also look like this. This snake obviously is already used to coming out of his enclosure and he wanted out. So I opened the enclosure and I remained nearby, and he's investigating the camera. He's coming really close to my face. So I decide to put my hand up there to see what he will do. I do nothing but put my hand adjacent to the enclosure threshold underneath the snake. It's much less scary for the snake if you present things underneath them rather than coming from above. Animals, including humans, are innately fearful of things looming over them or coming from above, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. So I came from underneath. He was free to continue to investigate my hand, my arm, my skin, or he was free to go left or right and leave me. He was free to go back into his enclosure. He chooses to actually come all the way out of his enclosure and climb onto me, which is actually now an introduction to handling, because now I'm actually holding him and carrying him, and this is exactly the way that we would ideally like to introduce picking up and handling, is have the snake let it be their decision to do that. Okay, the second option for introducing touch is to just briefly and considerately initiate touch yourself when the snake is already out, comfortable, relaxed, and exploring. So you're going to initiate touch from the middle of the snake's body, ideally from the side or underneath them, because that's much less threatening to them. You're going to avoid their head, tail, and touching them from above. Now, obviously down the road, these are things we would like the snake to get used to, but initially, we don't want to bombard them by touching them in the parts of their body that is going to make them the most scared. And that's going to be the head and tail and coming from above. So we want to get them used to those things down the road. But when we're just starting out, we want to be considerate and we want to gradually introduce them to allowing us to touch them by being the least scary thing that we can. And we're a lot less scary if we're coming at them from the middle of their body and underneath them. So in the pictures on the right, this snake, Fett, was already out enjoying an activity station. He was climbing around and he kind of came to rest in a semi-coiled position, and I just scooped him up from underneath. Oh, here he is right here. So I don't know if you can see this. He's on this activity station behind me, and I just kind of scoop him up from underneath like this. So in the case of this picture, Fett was already not moving, kind of coiled, and I scooped him up like if you're picking up a cinnamon roll from the bottom. And then I waited to see what he would do. And he looked at me, and then he started to stretch his head and neck out and climb up my arm, like you saw in the previous video. And I allowed him to do that, and we went from there. So this is the second way that you can introduce touch, is instead of allowing them to come to you, you can actually considerately approach them when they're already out. But you want to be very cautious about using this method because it can be scarier for the snake. Here's a video that shows that. This is a snake named Sarek who was already out of his enclosure and crawling across the floor. And I use this as an opportunity to introduce some touch. And in this case, also a little bit of handling. I pick him up, I carry him a few inches back over to this blanket, and I immediately set him down. And nothing else happened. That was it. So I introduced touch. I introduced a little bit of handling. I initially came at him from the side, and he didn't react to that. And so I put my fingers over the top and picked him up. Okay, this is the third method that you can introduce touch. And it's using an inanimate object that the snake's comfortable and familiar with and feels safe and secure on as an intermediary. So the snake isn't ready for you to just touch them, and the snake is not ready to just come and touch you. And so you can use some kind of intermediary object that they're comfortable with. It could be a tree branch, a log, a perch, their hide. It could be a random item that they are climbing on when they're out exercising, like that was climbing on these horseshoes, these decorative horseshoes. I could have used that. So you can use whatever the snake happens to be on as that intermediary object, and they're on that and feel safe. And so then you pick up that object, and that introduces you being a little closer to them and moving them around a little bit, and then you can slowly and considerately touch them a little bit while they're on that object. And that can be a lot less threatening to them than you just touching them without that intermediate thing kind of as a buffer between you and them. So when the snake's on this safe object, you're casually going to touch them a few times for just a few seconds, followed by leaving them alone. You're going to place them in a safe and familiar location when you're finished with the session, or you're going to just allow them to continue to explore. So in this photo, Hemmer is on his humid hide, and he was sitting on it. And so that would be a good opportunity for me to pick the humid hide up with him exposed and allow him to investigate my hands, maybe as it's holding the humid hide, or for him to investigate me. This is a video of Fett, who was on an activity station that I had set my hat on. I'd come in from the barn. I'd set my hat down on this station because it was just convenient. And I intended to pick my hat up and go back outside. I was taking a quick break. And when I came back, he was inside my hat. So this is an example of something that I could take advantage of as a training opportunity. He's in my hat. He chose to be there. He feels safe. So I could pick that whole hat up and hold him for a few seconds, carry him to another location, set him down, and he's going to feel my hands through the fabric, and all of that's just going to get him a little bit more comfortable with me being nearby and with my presence and a little bit of touch and handling through an intermediate object. This is another video showing an example of how we can use a third-party object to help us introduce touch and handling. He's on a rock, so I'm going to pick up the whole rock. I'm not deliberately touching him, but his body's brushing against me a little bit, and I'm not going to grab him. I'm holding the rock, and I'm allowing him to get his bearings. So at first you can see he kind of brings his body together like he's going to coil, but then he decides, oh, nothing's really happening. It's not really that scary after all. And he starts to relax. So I'm holding the rock. His body is a little bit against my hand. So by doing this, I'm introducing a little bit of touch. I'm introducing a little bit of carrying him and holding him, but I'm using the rock as an intermediate object to help him feel a little safer as we introduce this whole thing to him. And then I just put it back. So I don't do that for very long, and I put him back where he was when we started, or I might take him back to his habitat or someplace I know he feels comfortable and safe. You could use vines. You could use an activity station. that you've made. You could use just a PVC perch. It could be anything that the snake happens to already be on and using. And then you can take advantage of that intermediate object to facilitate you getting a little bit closer to your snake and starting to introduce some touch and handling to your snake. Now, I picked him up. Of course, Fett is used to this because you've seen him in a lot of other videos and he's a fairly confident snake. And so I picked him up, and at first he was kind of like, I don't really want you to pick me up, but then he's okay now, and I'm going to set him right back down. And in part 3 of this video, you're going to see a lot of this because this is how we introduce carrying them, picking them up, holding them outright, not for medical procedures or not for things that we're going to do to them, but just for those circumstances when we are literally just going to considerately and carefully pick them up and hold them and carry them from one place to another, or hold them while we're making a video, or show them to someone. That's going to be part 3, and it's going to be kind of exactly what you just saw here. And I don't know if you can see, I'm going to move the camera down a little bit. Now he's coming towards me. So he's moving towards me. He's sniffing my arm. He climbed a little bit on my shirt. And then as I started bringing my other hand over here and pointing at him, he turned back to his activity station. So this is another good example of he's on this activity station with his tail around this perch, and he feels safe and comfortable there. And it's a way that I can pick him up and move him around and introduce the concept to him, if he wasn't already used to it, that sometimes people might touch them a little bit and sometimes people might pick them up and carry them around a little bit. So this is that intermediate object. All right, the key points that we went over in this part, in part 2, and I'm going to put Fett back because he's like, why are you waving your hands around? Why are you moving me around so much? Just leave me on the activity station. Slowly using approach and retreat, and only proceeding further when the snake is comfortable and relaxed with each step along the way. We're going to gradually introduce touch. And options to do that include letting the snake initiate the touch first. Let them come to you. You initiating the touch once the snake's already out and comfortable and relaxed in a neutral space. Or using an intermediary, so an inanimate third-party object to act as a link between you and the snake, or to buffer contact between you and the snake if you're both not ready for that contact yet. And then we also utilize this along with the approach and retreat. And remember, anytime we're doing any of these things, if at any point the snake displays body language exhibiting fear, anxiety, distress, avoidance, and retreat behavior, defensive posturing, freezing, we're going to back off. We're going to retreat until they're comfortable and relaxed again. And then we're going to proceed with the next step if they're ready in that session, or we stop the session and we do another session another day. We're also going to stick to those same rules as we transition to handling. And I say transition to handling because we don't just go straight from this considerate touch and initiating touch and teaching them to be touched by us, or teaching them that they can touch us, to just handling them and carrying them and picking them up. There's a transition there. And you saw a little bit of that when Fett climbed out of his enclosure and onto my arm. He initiated some of me picking him up and carrying him and handling him because he climbed onto my arm, which is up in the air, and I can then move him around and carry him. So as we transition to handling, as the snake allows you to increase touching while remaining comfortable, you can start transitioning to this considerate handling. And you're going to pick up the snake for brief moments. You're going to carry the snake short distances with minimal or no restraint. In other words, if they're trying to move, don't try to stop them. If they're trying to get away, let them, as long as it's safe to do that. Don't let them fall onto the floor or escape into an unsafe area, but you want to let them move and have the perception that they can control getting away if they want to. And then you're going to place them down in a safe and familiar spot, and you're going to do that for several sessions until you can work up to more and more picking up and carrying and handling. That's what we're going to go over in part 3. So the next steps coming up in part 3. Where are you going, Fett? All right, our handling as in picking up and actually holding, like you see in these pictures here. I don't have an intermediate object or anything. They're not on a station. They're not on anything else. I'm just holding these two snakes in my hands, and I'm standing with one and I'm carrying the other one. So that's what part 3 is going to be about, is how do we get there? But once the snake is comfortable and relaxed with being touched, and once the snake is comfortable and relaxed with being carried after they've climbed onto you, or you've picked them up using an intermediary object, then they're possibly ready for us to start working towards desensitizing them to being completely picked up, carried, and considerately handled. Again, where did Fett go? Now he's in the dog kennel. And so now I am going to gently and considerately pick him up and bring him back over here, because he climbed off the activity stand and he climbed onto a dog kennel and was headed to the floor, which I would rather he not be there. So back to my last point here. If they're okay with touch, they're okay with momentarily being picked up and moved. If they're approaching us and climbing on us, then they're likely ready for us to work towards desensitizing them to being completely picked up, carried, and considerately handled. Again, I don't mean handled for medical procedures or for us to do things to them. I just mean handling like you see right now that I am doing with Fett as I make this video. I'm just holding him. So I could set him on a scale, I could set him on an activity station, I could put him back in his enclosure, or I could just let him down to roam. This is what I'm talking about that we will go over in part 3, is how do we get to this step. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, everybody, please remember to always be kind and love your animals. If you have questions about this or anything else related to animal behavior, training, enrichment, or welfare, you can contact me through my website at behavioreducation.org. Obviously, you can also find me on YouTube, and I am on Instagram, Facebook, Patreon, LinkedIn, and I think that's all the social media that I'm on. But if I'm on something else, you can usually find me just through my name, Lori Tarini, or through Spirit Keeper Equine Sanctuary, or through Behavior Education.